Hey guys, what's going on? It's me, Jay. I want to talk a little bit about the speech that Benjamin Netanyahu, aka Benjamin Milikowski, uh, um, gave at the UN, and people walked out of it. Benjamin Netanyahu, aka Bibi Netanyahu, aka Benjamin Milikowski, gave this speech at the UN where he pulled out a map because a lot happened during the UN General Assembly um, in the last week or so in terms of Middle Eastern relations. One, Great Britain recognized a Palestinian state for the first time ever in its history. The idea of a Palestinian state, as we've talked about on this channel before, has existed since 1964 specifically. It was a PLO conference in Khartoum in which the PLO declared their intentions to form a Palestinian state. Officially, they did it in 1988. In 1988, officially, Palestine became an observer state in the United Nations. But many Western nations did not recognize its sovereignty because they considered the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, a rogue regime, a terrorist group, whatever, going after Israel. But over the weekend, over the week, this week, Great Britain and France, following in France's lead, recognized the state of Palestine. You know, and Benjamin Netanyahu, he admonished them against doing that. He brought out a map. And he showed on the map everything in green that Israel has destroyed. They got rid of Assad's regime in Damascus. They neutralized the Houthis. They got rid of Yahya Sinwar, and they got rid of Hassan Nasrallah. Hey, Lisa, what's going on? All the stuff they did last year with the pagers and all that shit. Over the past 2 years since October 7th, all that they've done in the Middle East. And he said, if if the other countries recognize a Palestinian state, it will all be for nothing, and that it'll all go back to the way it was. That the Palestinian state will just be a de facto state. That it will be controlled by Iran. This is his um, his belief that if a Palestinian state were to exist, it would just be a terror state controlled by Iran, controlled by Hezbollah, controlled by Hamas, controlled by. He even called the Palestinian Authority a terrorist state. He made the false claim that the Palestinian Authority, which is headquartered in Ramallah, in that region, is a terrorist state, that it funds jihadis, right? And this is something that the right wing, the conservative party of Israel, like basically their version of what we would call the Republicans here in the United States, that they've always said. Keep in mind that Benjamin Netanyahu was one of those of the Likud party, the Republican party of the Israel, basically the right wing party of Israel. Um, that was against Oslo. And Oslo was the historic agreement in 1993, the first Oslo agreement between then Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and then PLO Chairman Yasser Arafat, in which the PLO and Israel, acknowledged one another, right? But it was Netanyahu that was in politics at that time in the 90s that was speaking against Rabin, as saying that Rabin was the next Hitler, that Rabin was a Nazi, that Rabin was selling out the Jewish people, and his rhetoric indirectly caused, and some say directly caused, the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin in 1995 by a Jewish extremist known as Yigal Amir. And then 2 years later, Netanyahu himself becomes the prime minister of Israel in 1997. So Netanyahu has always had this belief that there is no such thing as a Palestinian state. The Palestinian state does not exist. The Palestinian state is a fantasy. Also, when Israel unilaterally, both sides of the aisle, both the labor side, the left wing of Israel, and the Likud side of Israel, withdrew from the Gaza Strip in 1990. I mean, in 2005, under then Prime Minister Ariel Sharon. The Netanyahu at that time was out of politics, but he was against it. He was against the pullout because he believed that it would become a terror haven for Hamas at the time. But anyway, they walk out of the UN General Assembly. You see empty seats. He then thanks Donald Trump for Donald Trump bombing the Iranian nuclear facilities because um, basically Israel's army did not possess the capability to do that. So the point he was trying to make is that if Israel goes directly to war with Iran, if they had that little skirmish, back last year, it was last like 12 days, right? They infamously called the 12-day war of 2024. But if they were to go to war specifically with Iran, then they would need the United States' help. You know what I mean? Because they don't have, everybody talks about how great, and he talked about in the speech how great the Israeli secret services, the Mossad, right? How great they are, and how great the IDF is, and all that. The Shin Bet, their version of the uh, their version of Mossad is like their version of the CIA, and Shin Bet is like their version of the FBI, and then the Israeli army, the IDF. Everybody talks about how great those entities are, but in actuality, they're not as great as you think they are because they still need the United States. All of Israel's greatest victories have occurred because of the United States. In 1967, during the Six-Day War, when they captured the West Bank and the Gaza Strip for the first time from Egypt and Jordan, respectively, it was the United States helping them out, right? Because uh, the Arab community at that time was led by Gamal Abdel Nasser. And even though Gamal Abdel Nasser, the president of Egypt, was non aligned at the time, he did heavily favor the Soviet Union. And this was the Cold War. So, US needed an ally, so they helped Israel. But fast forward to like 10 years before that, in 1956, when uh, a combination of France and Britain and Israel, what they call the tripartite aggression, tried to go to war with Nasser because Nasser was taking back. In the 1800s, France helped build or build and finance the Suez Canal, little canal waterfront connecting Africa and Asia. So France had control of it up until the 1950s. Then Egypt in 1952, Egypt becomes an independent country on their own, and they want to take control of something that belongs to them, similar to how Panama wanted to do with the Panama Canal. But you know, the imperialist powers, the former imperialist power of Egypt and Great Britain and France, who owned the canal, they didn't want to do that, and Israel didn't want to do that either. So they went to war with Nasser. Nasser ends up winning, right? Because the United States, who the president at that time was Dwight D. Eisenhower, he says, he tells Israel, back off. Don't go to war with Egypt. and Egypt ends up winning, and Egypt ends up taking control of the Suez Canal, which they still have today. But point, the point in me saying that is that if if the United States doesn't back Israel's play in any country in the Middle East, you know, years before the war in Iraq, uh, um, Israeli prime ministers, all of them, Shimon Peres, Yitzhak Rabin, Yitzhak Shamir, all of them uh, beat the drum that Saddam Hussein was the greatest threat in the Middle East. Because during the Gulf War, Saddam Hussein not only did he invade Kuwait, which was the main cause of the Gulf War, but he also sent missiles to Tel Aviv. So they were sounding the drum that Saddam Hussein was the greatest threat. And after the Gulf War, George Bush pulls out. He gets Saddam to pull off Kuwait, but he doesn't overthrow Saddam. So they kept doing this, and Bill Clinton imposed the embargoes on Iraq all throughout the 90s. But all the Israeli prime ministers were trying to get us to go to war with Iraq. 9/11 happens, right? And then they still want to try to us to get rid of Saddam Hussein. So we finally get rid of Saddam Hussein, right? April 9, 2003, got rid of him. Now they've neutralized Nasser. Nasser in the 50s. Nasser was the biggest enemy, and Hafez al-Assad, Bashar al-Assad's father, in Syria and Egypt, respectively. Syria and Egypt even combined for a while to form the United Arab Republic, right? But that fell apart. Nasser, you know, is thrown out, and Anwar Sadat comes in, and then Anwar Sadat in the 70s makes peace between him and Menachem Begin with the Israelis. So Egypt is neutralized. Egypt was seen as the representative of the Arab world. Then Iraq was seen as the representative of the Arab world. Saddam is neutralized. Now it's not an Arab country that is the representative of the Arab world or the champion of the Arab world or the champion of the Palestinian cause. Now it's Iran. So for the past, I would say, 20 years now, since Iraq was overthrown, uh, Benjamin Netanyahu has been, and other Israeli prime ministers kind of before him, but especially Benjamin Netanyahu, because he's on the Israeli right. The Israeli right is very hawkish when it comes to war. It's different than his predecessors. Both when he before he came back, uh, you know, Yair Lapid and even Naftali Bennett, they were to the left of him, but people to the right of him, you know, uh, let's say like Ben Gvir or Ezra Smotrich, you know, all these right wing politicians, but headed by him specifically, have been championing war with Iran. Now they say the Iranian regime, the of the Islamic Republic in Iran, is the gravest threat to the Middle East. So they're always coming up with the gravest threat to the Middle East. It was used to be Assad got overthrown. It used to be Nasser got overthrown. It used to be Saddam Hussein, he got overthrown. So they're always trying to drag us for something to war in the Middle East. And the neoconservatives on our end, in our country, in our political breakdown, the neoconservatives also, want to exist in a perpetual state of war. Also, always looking for a new enemy, whether it's North Korea over the conflict with South Korea, whether it's Taiwan over, whether it's China over the sovereignty of Taiwan, whether it's the Middle East, especially the Middle East, right? Because many neoconservatives, it's a joke, but the word neoconservative is kind of it's a euphemism for Jewish, because neoconservatives, the genesis of the neoconservative former Trotskyite. The Trotskyites were uh, the opposing side of Joseph Stalin. After the death of Vladimir Lenin in the Soviet Union, there was a power struggle between uh, the faction of Joseph Stalin and the faction of Vladimir Lenin. And Vladimir Lenin, the faction of Joseph Stalin and the faction of Leon Trotsky. Leon Trotsky was then assassinated in Mexico. But Trotsky's followers, became anti-Stalinist just as much anti-Stalinist as conservatives were, right? So then what eventually happens is they then join the conservative party and they become the neoconservatives, but they still have that Trotskyite impulse, that communist-like impulse to conquer the world and set the world on various ideological trends, but they just infiltrate the they infiltrate the right wing party, they infiltrate the Republican Party. So beliefs that used to be beliefs that used to be part of beliefs that used to be part of the liberal movement. That, for example, um, Woodrow, going back to the progressive era, the end of the progressive era in the early 1900s, Woodrow Wilson said that basically said after World War One that it was America's responsibility to spread democracy, make the world safe for democracy. That was his slogan, right? That was a robust foreign policy was a democratic mantra, right? That was a mantra of the left, both the communist left and in the Democratic Party. But in the 1960s, many of these former Democrats and former communist leftists that were Trotskyites and were upset that Joseph Stalin took power after Lenin's death in the Soviet Union in 1924, they became Republicans and they became neoconservatives, but they still maintained their globalist agenda, but just with a conservative bent to it. And many of them took control of the administration during the presidency of George W. Bush. Lisa and I talked about uh, um, how there was a power struggle, an ideological power struggle in 2016 during the Trump election between various factions in the right. And the neoconservatives kind of lost out to the more what they call paleoconservatives or more American nationalists. Because traditionally, conservatism defined itself as being anti war, being isolationist. Warren G. Harding returned to normalcy after World War One. Calvin Coolidge and Herbert Hoover were all isolationists. Even during the rise of Adolf Hitler and the rise of the Nazis in Germany, America wanted to stay out of it. The conservative right in America wanted to stay out of it. The Father Coughlins and the Charles Limbaughs, or the Charles Lindberghs and stuff like that, they wanted to stay out of it. They were about America first. They didn't want to get involved. Now, some would say they didn't want to get involved because they were anti-Semitic and they didn't feel like it was worth to fight a war for Jewish people. And maybe there's some truth to that. But again, it's funny, the more things change, the more they stay the same. This is kind of like that now. Many people are saying, well, why should we go to war for Israel? Israel no longer poses the type of is no longer the type of strategic ally that she once was during the Cold War when we didn't have many allies in the Arab world. we needed an ally, and the Western world needed an ally, and Israel was kind of a buffer state. Same thing during the war on terror in the 2000s and 2010s. Israel was a Western democracy, and we needed a buffer state. But now it's sort of like there's no more ISIS, there's no more Al Qaeda, there's no more Soviet Union. Those things are kind of in the background now, and America's foreign policy has kind of shifted, kind of. But Donald Trump himself still has factions within his party that are pulling him in the neoconservative direction. You know, you still have the Lindsey Grahams, you still have the Ted Cruzes, right? You still have, even local senators and congressmen like Asa Hutchinson or Tom Cotton, right? The right wing, especially the evangelical right wing, is really still pulling him in the direction to become involved with wars in the Middle East. But as far as the rest of, and on behalf of Israel, as far as the rest of the world, um, the rest of the world, by evidence of that walkout, the rest of the world is not feeling where Bibi's coming from. You know what I mean? They're feeling like he is justifying a genocide. He is justifying the ethnic cleansing of Gaza and the retaking control of Gaza by the Israeli establishment. Now, why bring Candace Owens up in this video? Because Candace Owens is still beating the drum against Bibi Netanyahu. Now, I think she has her own axe to grind in a way. You know, she kind of doesn't like Jewish people. She's kind of anti Semitic. And again, I don't come at it from that angle. I come at it from a right and wrong angle. I feel like Israel is ethnically trying to ethnically cleanse, the Palestinians and other, Israeli historians, testify to this. What they did during the Nakba, the removal of many Palestinians out of the various Palestinian and Arab villages that now comprise the modern day state of Israel. They ethnically cleansed, and they would probably like to do the same thing in Gaza and especially in the West Bank, because the West Bank is that contentious area with the Jewish people, what Israelis call Judea and Samaria. That's the contentious area. That's the area where you have the cave of Machpelah, which is important in Hebron to the Jewish people, right? Because it's where their patriarchs are buried: Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, and Rebecca. Um, uh, Rachel and Jacob, the foremothers and the forefathers of the Jewish religion: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and their wives, and that gave birth to the Jewish religion, right? So that's important to them. The tomb of King David is important to them. The tomb of, um, I believe Ruth's tomb also. And of course, the holy sites within what they call the Old City, East Jerusalem. Those are important to them. But those are also important things in the Muslim religion and in the Christian religion. They're important in all three religions, and that's why they are contentious. They're also, Hebron is a very interesting city because not only the cave of Machpelah, the the tomb of the patriarchs, but also because it was the site of two distinct massacres: the massacre of Jewish people in Hebron in 1929, which was one of the first um, you know, shots across the barrel, as it were, in the conflict, and also a massacre of Muslims by a Jewish extremist named Baruch Goldstein in 1994. Baruch Goldstein was an EMT. He was originally from Brooklyn. He made a pilgrimage to Aliyah pilgrimage to Israel in the 90s, and he was involved with Mira Kahana's movement, a Jewish extremist movement, and he murdered various people in the Ibrahimi Mosque in Hebron. on Purim, the Jewish holiday of Purim. So two times in history uh, that was a seat of conflict. It remains a seat of conflict because it's majority Palestinian, but at the same time, it's a major uh, holy site in the Jewish religion. So, and you have Nablus, which was if you read the Bible, Nablus is the place where Jacob, who became Israel, wrestles with God. The God comes down and wrestles with God or the angel, and he builds a shrine, which in Hebrew is called Shechem, right? But eventually the Greeks get a hold of it and they call it Napolis, which means the city in Greek, and the Arabs translated from Napolis to Nablus. You know, so kind of the site of before Jerusalem, that was kind of the original first temple, right? So that's an important site in all these religions. Where King David is and things of that nature. And of course, like I said, Jerusalem. I don't have to explain to anybody who's any kind of serious student of history why Jerusalem is important to any of these religions. You know what I mean? So uh, uh, I consider Benjamin Milikowski, aka Benjamin. Now, why I keep calling him that? Benjamin Netanyahu's father was a Jewish professor, a Jewish history professor from his family is originally from Poland. Like all the founders of the state of Israel, whether it's Ben Gurion, whether it's Menachem Begin, whether it's Zeb Jabotinsky, whether it's any of them, most of them came from Eastern Europe, and most of them specifically came from Poland. And Benjamin Netanyahu's family, his father, Benzion Milikowski, came originally from Poland, and that was his original name. But to reconnect with the land, as it were, they changed their name to Hebrew names. Remember, Hebrew was a dead language for 2,000 years. It was a liturgical language. It was heard in the synagogues. It was heard during the